What's going on? Welcome to Victims and Villains. If you're new to this channel, we talk about mental health through pop culture. My name's Captain Nostalgia, and today we are talking about the Pope's Exorcist. If you guys couldn't be with us in person this weekend to celebrate Horrific Hope Film Festival, our very own film festival, it just happens to be horror-centric, mental health focused. Shout out to our sponsors, by the way: Convicted Printing, Diabolical DVD, Fierce Literature, Horror Pack, You Have to Watch This Podcast, and an anonymous donor. Pope's Exorcist is also releasing this weekend, and it just happens to deal with horror and mental health, so let's get into it. This movie tells the story of a famous priest named Father Amuth who finds himself working on an exorcist case that happens to be his greatest challenge. I feel like I don't see Russell Crowe the way that these days, the way that we did in the 90s and the early 2000s. I feel like he's very selective with his projects. Like when actors pick quality over quantity, because just because you see someone less doesn't necessarily mean that they've kind of lost their talent. I don't like the fact that Russell Crowe is very selective with his roles. It means that he takes a lot of pride in his roles. And even if he's in the role for a very short time, cough, cough, love and thunder, I nonetheless really liked him in this role. I think he shines in this role. I think this movie doesn't work without someone like Crowe at the center. I can't speak for everyone, and maybe this is my own background with being a Christian, but movies like The Pope's Exorcist always feel a little bit more heavier, like the stakes are actually like matter. The risks are bigger. Everything about these just seems like it's heavier in tone. And I can't really point to a whole lot of Exorcist type movies that interject a whole lot of like comedic moments in throughout. It's one of the very surprising things that I found with The Pope's Exorcist is, especially with Crowe's character, is Crowe's kind of like, he's a guy that, we'll talk about this a little bit more in the mental health section, but he hides behind comedy as a means to kind of lighten the tone of what some of his patients are going through. And I think not only does that give the film a sense of realism and authenticity, but also at the same time it helps it stand out where other Exorcist movies have actually failed. I've said it on this channel before, movies revolving around exorcisms as the center point of their narrative always feel like a dime a dozen. Like, to me, in my book, The Exorcist obviously is the GOAT. Then you have The Exorcism of Emily Rose, and you have the first Conjuring. The rest of the Conjuring films, in my opinion, are fine, but the first one really does kind of belong with those three. And then I feel like you have a film like The Pope's Exorcist that doesn't quite earn that status, but does enough differently to help itself stand out. And it kind of mixes the genre a little bit. It kind of throws your expectations out the window. If you're coming into this movie expecting a pretty cut and dry film that's going to follow the Exorcist formula, you will get some of that structure, because again, these movies all kind of coincide, but there's enough that's different about it. I've mentioned Crowe's comedy and how he kind of uses that as to kind of showcase his charisma as an actor, but also gives his character a little bit of depth. I have a little bit of problem with the character development. I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But there's actually a point in the film as it develops where it kind of becomes this like underlining mystery that opens and welcomes up a little bit of an action subplot that you don't really get to see in films like this. There are elements that really just feel refreshing for a movie that could have just been really cookie cutter, really dry. And it still has a little bit of those formulaic elements, but they are very far and few between. I feel like when it comes to exorcism movies, one thing that always is like kind of like a cornerstone of this subgenre is a lack of character development. And unlike the slasher subgenre where you're basically meeting people just to see how creative the directors can get in terms of deaths, that does not necessarily apply here. And I will say that I do give them credit on attempting character development, but an attempt still makes you fall short. Every character in this movie is one note. Crowe's maybe two. Crowe just happens to be a gentleman who survived World War II, found ministry, and has a regret about a case that he couldn't solve. Daniel Zovatto's character, who plays another priest in this movie, has regrets about a previous relationship that he had. The family at the center of the story just happens to be grief-stricken because of the loss of their husband and father the year before the events of the film. But there's never really any growth past those things. Like, we just kind of meet them for a couple of days and the events of the film happen, and yeah. I know that's a writing issue and not necessarily an acting issue. On the acting front, I've already talked about my thoughts on Crowe. Obviously, this film is anchored by his performance, but the rest of the cast, I feel like, does a really also good job. I really liked Zovatto. I thought that he was a great juxtaposition against Crowe because they kind of had very similar goals in the film, but also at the same time their characters were vastly different, but then they kind of learned that they're vastly similar, and just kind of seeing their character journey I thought was wonderful. I think the use of religion in this movie is also fascinating to talk about, and we may or may not be doing a podcast on this film later on in the year. The reason that I bring that up is because the way that I've seen other kind of stories like this use the religion, it's always kind of like the localized church, but this one is kind of dealing with the Vatican and kind of the politics within, and I just kind of thought, again, what a fascinating and refreshing take to add to the story. Sometimes with lower budget films, you have the suffering of CGI, and this one I feel like is really noticeable. Like, I just want to point this out. This is the young boy that plays the possessed victim at the center of the story. Notice him. You know, in Captain America, the first Avenger, where they take Skinny Steve's body but put Big Steve's like finished product on the head, and it's just kind of like an awkward, like really noticeable CGI difference. That's how it felt for the majority of this film every time the camera would pin on this kid. And I honestly couldn't tell if it was just really bad CGI or really creative just positioning of the camera. It was really awkward to see, but once I kind of made that Captain America connection, I couldn't unsee it. Also, I believe in giving credit where credit is due, and this kid does a great job. Definitely one of the better child performances I've seen recently, especially in horror. The CGI is kind of the big eyesore of the third act, and I get it. When you're dealing with lower budget films or independent movies, sometimes you are not going to make them look like blockbusters like Transformers, the MCU, or the DC movies. And that's not necessarily a fault of the filmmakers here. It just feels like the climax was a little bit bigger than their budget, and the visuals kind of suffered for it. Pacing of this movie is awkward, to say the least. I would probably say about 85% of this movie is paced really well. There is 15% where the film does drag, and it's not like a consistent part of the film. It's definitely like a little bit here, a little bit there, like scenes that just kind of don't really work for the larger story. They just kind of feel tacked on. But let's run this one through our Rorschach rating scale. I'm going to go ahead and give The Pope's Exorcist a 3.5 out of 5. I think Russell Crowe leads this with an exceptional charge. This movie offers enough surprising for longtime fans of the exorcism subgenre, and it's a great kickoff point for those that may be interested in checking out other movies like this. I do have a couple issues with the pacing of the film, some of the CGI, and kind of how the characters are developed. But again, overall, there's a lot to really like about this movie, and I just thought it was probably one of the better exorcism movies that I've seen. So if you guys have seen The Pope's Exorcist, what did you guys think? Comment below and let me know. But let's talk about mental health. If you guys are new to our content, Mental Health Moment is where we take a theme of mental health out of the film which we're reviewing, talk about it for a few moments in the hopes to deconstruct the stigma surrounding mental health. I'm just going to take a quote from Russell Crowe's character in this movie, and he says, "Trauma is a gateway." And I've never heard such a profound statement, and how true that is. Because trauma, if it's left unchecked, opens you up to things like addiction, alcoholism, self-abuse, self-mutilation, self-hatred, depression, anxiety, and even suicide. From someone who has experienced his own trauma, and leaving it unrecognized has been a gateway into things like depression and addiction for me personally. Everyone deals with it differently. Everyone deals with trauma differently, but leaving it unresolved and unchecked definitely is a gateway for some truly deadly consequences if it's left long enough. I feel like for this portion of the video, I typically will talk a little bit longer, but honestly I feel like this phrase, trauma is a gateway, is such a profound statement that I just want to encourage you to just click the links in the descriptions below and check out our mental health resource library if you're suffering from general mental health practices or issues, suicide, bullying, there's addiction. There's a number of resources down below as well, and I encourage you guys to check them out. The Pope's Exorcist is now playing in theaters everywhere from Screen Gems. And in that comment below, you guys will also find links to that will be the subscribe button, as well as links to all of our podcasts, more movie reviews like this, the Mental Health Resource Library, one more time, Patreon, and of course, all of our social media. Have a good night.